it's really liberating to just take in the both sides, the spin on both sides. It somehow unlocks your mind to like think on your own, to realize that I don't know. It's the same thing that was useful, right, in Soviet Union times for when everybody was much more aware that they're surrounded by propaganda,
That
right?
is so interesting what you're saying, actually. So Noam Chomsky, used to be our MIT colleague, once said that propaganda is to democracy what violence is to totalitarianism. And what he means by that is, if you have a really totalitarian government, you don't need propaganda.
Right.
People will do what you want them to do anyway, out of fear, right?
Yes.
But otherwise, you need propaganda. So I would say actually that the propaganda is much higher quality in democracies, much more believable. And it's
That's
really
brilliant.
It's really striking when I talk to colleagues, science colleagues like from Russia and China and so on. I noticed they are actually much more aware of the propaganda in their own media than many of my American colleagues are about the propaganda in Western media.
That's brilliant. That means the propaganda in the Western media is just better.
Yes.
That's so
Everything's
brilliant.
better in the West, even the propaganda.
Man.
But
That's good.
But once you realize that, you realize there's also something very optimistic there that you can do about it, right? Because first of all, omissions, as long as there's no outright censorship, you can just look at both sides and pretty quickly piece together a much more accurate idea of what's actually going on, right?
And develop a natural skepticism too.
Yeah.
Just an analytical, scientific mind about the way you take in the information.
Yeah. And I think I have to say, sometimes I feel that some of us in the academic bubble are too arrogant about this and somehow think, oh, it's just people who aren't as educated as us who are fooled.
Yeah.
When we are often just as gullible also, we read only our media and don't see through things. Anyone who looks at both sides like this and compares a little will immediately start noticing the shenanigans being pulled. And I think what I try to do with this app is that the big tech has to some extent tried to blame the individual for being manipulated, much like big tobacco tried to blame the individuals entirely for smoking. Mm-hmm. And a little later on, our government stepped up and said, actually, you can't just blame little kids for starting to smoke. We have to have more responsible advertising and this and that. I think it's a bit the same here. It's very convenient for big tech to blame. So it's just people who are so dumb and get fooled. Yeah. The blame usually comes in saying, oh, it's just human psychology. People just want to hear what they already believe. But Professor David Rand at MIT actually partly debunked that with a really nice study showing that people tend to be interested in hearing things that go against what they believe if it's presented in a respectful way. Like, suppose, for example, that you have a company and you're just about to launch this project and you're convinced it's going to work. And someone says, Lex, I hate to tell you this, but this is going to fail, and here's why. Would you be like, shut up, I don't want to hear it? La, 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 la.
Yeah.
Would you? You would be interested, right?
Yes.
And also, if you're on an airplane, back in the pre-COVID times, and the guy next to you is clearly from the opposite side of the political spectrum, but is very respectful and polite to you, wouldn't you be kind of interested to hear a bit about how he or she thinks about things?
Of course.
Right? But it's not so easy to find out respectful disagreement now, because, like, for example, if you are a Democrat and you're like, oh, I want to see something on the other side, so you just go Breitbart.com. Mm-hmm. And then after the first 10 seconds, you feel deeply insulted by something, and it's not going to work. Or if you take someone who votes Republican and they go to something on the left, and they just get very offended very quickly by them having put a deliberately ugly picture of Donald Trump on the front page or something, it doesn't really work. So this news aggregator also has this nuance slider, mm-hmm. which you can pull to the right, and then to make it easier to get exposed to actually more sort of academic style or more respectful
mm-hmm. That's brilliant.
Portrayals of different views. And finally, the one kind of bias I think people are mostly aware of is the left-right, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's so obvious, because both left and right are very powerful here, right? Both of them have well-funded TV stations and newspapers, and it's kind of hard to miss. But there's another one, the establishment slider, which is also really fun. I love to play with it. And that's more about corruption.
Yes.
Because if you have a society where almost all the powerful entities want you to believe a certain thing, that's what you're going to read in both the big media, mainstream media on the left and on the right, of course. And powerful companies can push back very hard. Like tobacco companies pushed back very hard back in the day when some newspapers started writing articles about tobacco being dangerous. So that it was hard to get a lot of coverage about it initially. And also, if you look geopolitically, right? Of course, in any country, when you read their media, you're mainly going to be reading a lot about articles about how our country is the good guy and the other countries are the bad guys, right? So if you want to have a really more nuanced understanding, like the Germans used to be told that the British used to be told that the French were the bad guys, and the French used to be told that the British were the bad guys. And now they visit each other's countries a lot and have a much more nuanced understanding. I don't think there's going to be any more wars between France and Germany. But on the geopolitical scale, it's just as much as ever, a big Cold War now, US, China, and so on. And if you want to get a more nuanced understanding of what's happening geopolitically, then it's really fun to look at this establishment slider, because it turns out there are tons of little newspapers, both on the left and on the right, who sometimes challenge establishment and say, maybe we shouldn't actually invade Iraq right now. Maybe this weapons of mass destruction thing was BS. If you look at the journalism research afterwards, you can actually see that quite clearly, that both CNN and Fox were very pro, let's get rid of Saddam, there are weapons of mass destruction. Then there were a lot of smaller newspapers. They were like, wait a minute, this evidence seems a bit sketchy, and maybe but of course, they were so hard to find. Most people didn't even know they existed, right? Yet it would have been better for American national security if those voices had also come up. I think it harmed America's national security, actually, that we invaded Iraq.
And arguably, there's a lot more interest in that kind of thinking, too, from those small sources. So, like, when you say big, it's more about kind of the reach of the broadcast. But it's not big in terms of the interest. I think there's a lot of interest in that kind of anti-establishment or like skepticism towards, out of the box thinking. There's a lot of interest in that kind of thing.